All right, today we have part two with William Grazione. Last week we had such a great interview with Will, and we at the end didn't really get time to finish everything we wanted to finish. We both had to hop off for other calls, but we started really talking about fat loss. So just to reintroduce, in case you missed the last episode, today we have William Grazione on the podcast. He's the founder and CEO of The Educated Dieter, which provides evidence-based nutrition and exercise coaching, also advanced coaching systems, where he mentors and teaches other coaches. He's also the host of Hey Coach Radio podcast. He himself has been a natural pro bodybuilder with a BS in nutrition and exercise science. As a bodybuilding coach, he's helped his athletes earn over 50 pro cards and win 8 world championships. He's also a contributor to Dr. Bill Campbell's research review. And just once again, if you haven't listened to Will before, he is a plethora of knowledge around body transformation, and we're very fortunate to have him on today. So yeah, Will, welcome back.
Thanks so much for having me back on, Luke, man. I obviously last week we kind of opened up a can of worms, right? So I thought it was only right that, we invest some more time into this podcast, into these episodes, so we can really provide a lot of wisdom to the audience that's tuned in to your show.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate it. So yeah, the big thing we want to cover today is just, fat loss. It's something that a lot of people just think is as simple as, calories in, calories out, you just exercise. And, obviously in many ways it's beyond that. So last week we got into talking a little bit more about how your approach to overall fat loss. So let's say someone comes to you, let's say it's, a lot of people we coach are women too, because first of all, actually, let's start with this. What are the biggest differences with fat loss with women and men? Like, why is it harder for women to lose fat than it is for men?
Yeah. So the question is, why is it more challenging for a woman's physiology to adapt to the stressors of fat loss than a male's physiology? One of them is simply just the fact that our bodies are different, right? I don't think it's any rocket science to say that men's bodies are different than women's bodies. And a long time ago, I recall stating that you should not be dieting your female clients like your male clients because they don't respond the same. You'll typically notice that females will have more stalls. They don't lose as much weight in some cases. There's more things to consider because their hormones are in fluctuation each month, whereas a male's hormones just stay normal pretty much, month to month to month to month. So they don't have to worry about the fluctuations of estrogen and progesterone like women do. Opening up the hormonal can, men are androgen dominant. So we have a lot of testosterone and lesser amounts of estrogen and progesterone. Women have more estrogen and progesterone that is in fluctuation on a monthly basis, which is why they get a cycle. They're obviously intended to conceive and bear children, and they have a lesser amount of testosterone. So before we dive any deeper, it's important to identify the physiological differences of men and women. Men have more testosterone, which basically means we are more resilient to stressors, right? We are intended to go hunt for the bear per se, right? We are typically bigger, stronger, faster, those types of things. Not all the time, depending on the genetics of the man. There are some very strong women out there nowadays. And the female physiology is different than that. So progesterone is the calming hormone. Okay. So for the female physiology to remain healthy, they also have to remain calm. Okay. Now, to connect those dots, in a healthy woman, progesterone would spike in the luteal phase of the cycle. For those that aren't aware, there's 2 different parts of a cycle, 3, depending on how you consider it. But there's the early follicular phase, which is like the first 2 weeks of menstruation, right? And then you would have your ovulatory phase, which is the day 15 in the middle. And then you have your luteal phase, which is usually from day 16 to the end of the cycle. Sometimes it's 28 days, sometimes it's 31 days. But nonetheless, in a healthy woman, that's basically how it would operate. You'll notice that oftentimes your girlfriend, yourself, your wife, whatever it is, they're very much so almost like more even keeled and more like guys after they have their period and their period's over. right? And then they're like, hey, I feel strong. I feel good today. Like I want to go to the gym. I want to work out. I want to do these things. And then after ovulation occurs, you start to notice that they're a little bit more not as much as like they were, right? So it's like, oh, I'm feeling more tired. I'm feeling bloated now. Like, why are these things happening? And then boom, 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 they gain a couple pounds of water weight because of the estrogen spike that happens in the luteal phase. Um, and then they're in a position where they have their period, they get their period, right? And so from a physiological perspective, those are kind of the differences between men and women is men's hormone levels essentially stay kind of even keel, whereas a woman's are constantly fluctuating. And so to say that women can diet like men, in my opinion, is not very good fitness related advice because of the fact that our physiologies respond differently to stress. So for a man, in most cases, you would say that when men undergo a lot of stress, okay, we actually take that stress to our hearts, which is why men typically die of heart attacks a lot more frequent than women do, because all stress that we accumulate in our life hits us right there in the chest, right? It hits us right in the heart. For women, it actually manipulates their hormone levels. Okay. Now, first and foremost, under high states of stress, it will start likely in the GI tract. So under high states of stress, you notice maybe you get constipated, there's some bloating going on, those types of things. And then those bowel or GI problems typically then begin to filter out into the system to affect their hormonal profile. So this is why women typically develop hormone imbalances a lot more frequently or more likely than men do, is because the stress for a woman negatively impacts progesterone and her gut and bowel motility first. Okay. So therefore, if you're maybe start a client up and she's like, hey, yeah, like I'm excited to get coaching with you, but like I only go to the bathroom like once every 3 days, maybe I was dieting really hard before with another coach and I lost my period. Please be mindful. Like I mentioned, progesterone is the calming hormone. So if progesterone drops because you're under high stress, cortisol and progesterone cannot live in even amounts. One is either high and the other one's low, or one's high and the other one's low. So it's kind of like a seesaw, right? High stress, low progesterone, guaranteed. High progesterone, low stress, guaranteed. Now, the female that is combating this stress, if she has more testosterone, okay, she's capable of more resiliency. So she can likely handle higher training demands, right? You ever seen a woman just wide shoulders, very muscular, but she's natural, right? She likely has very healthy androgens and she trains hard and her body's like, not a problem. I can respond to this perfectly, right? But then you take a woman that's maybe more of like pear shaped, right? And you put her on the same training program and she just gets crushed, not responding, staying sore forever, so on and so forth. And so, why is it easier for men to respond to fat loss than it is for women? The way that I just stated is because men are more built for resiliency under stress, and women have the ability to basically suffer metabolic adaptations, long-term metabolic adaptations that slow down metabolism at a higher degree than men do.
Yeah, definitely a lot of detail that just went into that answer, and appreciate you sharing that. So when you're first starting with the female client, let's say a female client comes to you, you mentioned obviously hormonal imbalances being much more prevalent in women. How do you tell if someone is like ready to go on a diet? Do you do specific blood tests? Do you go based off of like biomarkers that they talk to you about? Like, how do you determine how to start a woman?
Yeah, so I have what's referred to as a metabolic stress questionnaire. We actually have multiple questionnaires in my business because depending on who contacts us, then I know what I need to send to them, right? But let's just say, as an example, if a woman came to us and she complained that maybe she has a little bit of bloating or she's having problems losing body fat or, something like that, achy joints, very emotional, things like that, then I would have her complete an MSQ, again, metabolic stress questionnaire. And if she completes that MSQ and we get that back and it's a 30 or less total score, 30 or less, in many cases, I don't need to take a functional nutrition approach with this client. She'll likely respond normally like the rest of people would. Raise their calories to reverse diet them, take some calories away to put them in a deficit, that type of thing. They'll respond to a training program, you know, all that.
Can I pause you for 1 second, actually?
Yeah, sure. Go ahead.
Sorry. So this stress questionnaire,
Mhm.
what are like, if you're okay with me asking, like, what are like a couple of the questions that you ask or some of the key things that determine someone's score?
Yeah, absolutely. So the very first thing that we take a look at, I think I'll identify that this is a number-based questionnaire. Okay. Now, the things that we're actually looking at here is going to be, we'll start with a score of 0 is like, I never have this side effect and there's no symptom, right? Number 4 is I frequently have this thing and the effect is very severe. So we start all the way with the head and we work our way down the body. Okay. So we ask about the head, skin, weight issues, eyes, heart, energy and activity, ears, lungs, mind, nose, digestive tract, emotions, the throat and the mouth, joints and muscle, and then we have an others portion as well. I'll tell you, the ones that I see typically the most with an elevated score is normally the digestive tract, because remember, like I said, most of these issues begin to start a problem in the GI tract, right? So just think about the chronically dieted woman, okay? And she's been on low calories for a while and she starts to notice, I'm not going to the bathroom every day anymore. Why does this happen? Well, your body has identified that it needs to slow down the excretion, right? So then it's storing because you're not eating enough calories to keep bowel motility alive. When this happens, you start to develop bloating, you start to develop the potential to experience something like SIBO, which is small intestinal bacterial overgrowth. And in many cases, if we can help to get them going to the bathroom every day again, it also helps to speed up phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification, which actually is kind of like the first step towards getting the hormonal profile back online, which we can talk a little bit more about later. And then the other one is usually emotions. We see joints and muscle aches pretty frequently, and that's pretty common for women that are very low testosterone. And then we see a lot of weight problems. So like binge eating, cravings, excessive weight, compulsive eating, water retention, those types of things. And then we also see a lot with energy, such as like fatigue, sluggishness, lethargy, restless leg syndrome, can't fall asleep at night, those type of things.
Yeah, I appreciate you kind of going through some of that, the questionnaire there. And one of the things you mentioned is gut health, which has been something that's been talked a lot more recently. Like, how would you say that gut health impacts fat loss?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say this, if you have somebody that's experiencing bloating or the inability to use the restroom on a daily basis, what's actually happening is that they're restricting their detoxification pathways. Okay. So our bodies, in order to detoxify, need to go to the bathroom in order to do so. Now, if you get to a point where you're like some women out there that are going to the bathroom maybe like once every 3 to 4 days, which you would probably agree with me, you probably hear it, right?
Yeah.
Then in that case, in order to get detoxification going again, we need to get them going to the bathroom every day. How that affects fat loss is, in lieu of not going to the bathroom, what can happen is that there's an accumulation of a hormone in the gut called estrobolome. Okay. Now, when estrobolome can't exit the gut, it is then recirculated back up the system. And this is essentially what leads to women becoming estrogen dominant. Okay. So if you can't detoxify the estrogens, then those estrogens are basically put back up into the system. And then estrogen in their body begins to accumulate. Now, if estrogen gets too high, what is then regarded as estrogen dominance is basically the relationship between progesterone, the calming hormone, and estrogen. And any of your listeners right now, you could go to Google and you could type in progesterone to estrogen ratio calculator, and it will give you a calculation of where you should be. Now, for women, why this is important is because in many cases, as estrogen begins to climb, okay, because they're not detoxifying, maybe they're drinking alcohol to cope with stress, maybe they're getting really stressed out, maybe they've been on a low calorie diet, high training program for a long period of time, and progesterone starts to drop because cortisol is going up and now they're estrogen dominant. The reason why this is valuable is because as estrogen begins to climb, estrogen in many cases follows body fat, okay, or body fat follows estrogen, okay. So let me give you an example. And I know I'm going to open up a big can of worms here, but that's okay. Have you ever known a woman that got placed on a birth control and she immediately gained like 10 to 20 pounds?
Yeah.
Of course. Why? The answer to that is because all birth controls make women estrogen dominant. Okay. So how do they do this? Birth controls make women estrogen dominant because what they actually do is they make them relative estrogen dominant, which essentially means that the birth control is designed to shut down progesterone in the female physiology. It shuts down progesterone with progestins. Okay. Now, once it's suppressed progesterone, then remember what I told you about the equation? If progesterone plummets, what happens to estrogen? It becomes the dominant form of hormone, right? And so that's essentially why it's valuable, in my opinion. If you could get estrogen under control and you can maintain a good balance between estrogen and progesterone, the female physiology is much more likely to be able to oxidize body fat versus being estrogen dominant and continuously asking the body to keep oxidizing body fat. What I can tell you is that in the women that I've worked with that have been on birth control, in many cases, it's not that we can't have them lose body fat and improve their body composition, because we still can. It's just in many cases, we likely need to diet them harder than we do women that are not taking birth control. The other thing to consider with hormonal-based contraceptives, and keep in mind, I'm just scratching the surface here, is that in many cases, they will also reduce androgens, okay? Androgens being testosterone, which we all know, like if you have healthy androgens and healthy hormones, you're likely have more ability to build muscle versus somebody that has very low androgens, okay? So they can actually suppress your ability to build muscle if you're kept on them long enough and you remain unbalanced for a very long period of time. So to answer the question, how do these things affect fat loss? I think that sums it up pretty well.
Yeah, for sure.
Also, I'll mention one more thing. Most birth controls lead to insulin resistance as well, which is why you have to diet women harder when they're taking birth control, because it's harder for them to become insulin resistant.
Sure.
And then also, it's also harder to reach insulin sensitivity if you're constantly bloated because your body's not detoxifying. And in lieu of that, you're actually not metabolizing at your optimal ability.
So that actually is something that I really appreciate you bringing up, is the birth control piece. So there are obviously a couple different scenarios here. Like there could be a client who comes to you who was on birth control for a while, now is off birth control. There's also a client who come to you who is still currently on birth control. Are those handled differently? How would you handle each one of those differently?
Yeah, absolutely. So they have to be. And I think what we have to do before we can begin to discuss any of the application of it is to identify what can happen to a woman when they come off of birth control. And I'll preface this by saying that if you want to fix your hormones, you cannot diet. I'm going to say that probably 4 or 5 times in a row. If you want to fix your hormones, you cannot be in a calorie deficit. If you want to fix your hormones, you cannot be in a calorie deficit. Okay. Because in order for your hormones to begin to regenerate and to do what they're naturally designed to do, you need energy availability in order to do that. Lack of energy availability means lack of signaling, which means lack of production. Everybody got it? So if, let's say, a man diets for a bodybuilding show and he gets down to where he's got striated glutes, right? Luke, what happens to our natural testosterone? Plummets, right? It absolutely plummets. Same thing happens for the female, right? And so let's start there. There's only 3 things that can happen when a woman comes off of any form of birth control. One of them is that they are kept estrogen dominant, meaning that estrogen starts to climb, androgens, testosterone stay low, and then progesterone stays low as well. Okay. The other thing that can happen is that they become, they are flatlined, which basically means that all their hormones are suppressed. So testosterone suppressed, estrogen suppressed, and progesterone suppressed. The other thing that can happen is that they become androgen dominant, which is actually a pretty severe thing that we see in the functional nutrition space. which could essentially lead women to developing PCOS or polycystic ovarian syndrome, is because if it's not caught, then androgens become the dominant hormone and basically take off. And a woman with too high of androgen production, that can be not a good thing either. That can be a pretty bad deal for most women. And so the way that you would handle all three of those cases is actually much different. That could take us in for a whole nother hour, but the way that you would handle those cases is all different. But in theory, the outcome should kind of be the same. Like the North Star, the flag post should kind of be the same. And the flag post should be, we need to return them back to a normal level of homeostasis where they feel good, right? And so I'll bring up one thing. Again, number one thing, we cannot diet them if you're trying to improve their hormonal health. Number two thing is that, they should not be looking at tolerating a bunch of additional stressors, no low calorie diets, no 5-day-a-week training programs. Like you're really trying to take stress back and fill the proverbial gaps where they may be deficient. The only way that you know where they're deficient is you would have to go get blood work done. Okay. And I mean real lab work. And I don't mean normal annual primary care physician blood work. I mean real blood work where they're basically testing everything that's correlated to your CMP, your CBC, your blood glucose, your insulin, C-reactive protein, your thyroid, your sex hormones, your stress hormones, all of that. We need all that information to be able to decide where are they deficient and essentially what do we need to start to work on to be able to get these people that are dealing with these, call them what they are, they're life-altering circumstances. What do we need to do to get them back in line? And normally, if you're doing a good job at this, you can get people back to a pretty healthy place, probably within 6 to 12 months.
Yeah, obviously a lot of different things to go over and explain there. I really appreciate you sharing all that in detail. And obviously, this is something that requires even more detail. But for the sake of time, we'll definitely kind of pause there. So, one thing that a lot of women who are listening to this right now, they're probably thinking like, "Wow, this sounds like overwhelming. Like so many different things to focus on." So, if you could sum like this maybe up in like 60 seconds or less, if a woman comes to you and she's just like, "I'm having trouble losing fat. What do I do?" Obviously, that I know there are a lot of things you could say here. Like, what would be like your abbreviated version of what you would say to a woman?
Yeah, in my experience, I've been doing this for over 13 years. I think most of the time they likely need to reverse diet. And so what I mean by reverse diet is just not put them in a calorie deficit for at least 6 months. That would be my initial reaction. Because the reality is most women are walking around with like subclinical hypothyroidism and I don't even know it. Right. So what that is where your thyroid's underactive and thus that it basically shuts down your ability to burn as many calories as maybe you did as a young, youthful woman. Now you've been dieting for on and off for the last 10 to 20 years, and you want to put your metabolism back in a healthier position so you can lose fat in the future. My best advice is to thrive, stay in that thrive phase for at least 6 months. In that phase, focus on body recomposition. So getting calories up as high as you can, but not making yourself insulin resistant, build muscle, lose some body fat, call it body recomposition if you'd like, and manage your lifestyle stressors. Manage your lifestyle as best you can. Drink enough water, get awesome amounts of sleep, find something that you can do to take stress away from your body. And I don't mean spend more time in the gym because believe it or not, your workouts are actually stressful. Pick up something like yoga, take more walks, and if you identify as somebody being very stressed, think about using things that are like adaptogenic herbs like ashwagandhas and things like magnesium at night before bed to help you calm and to help you sleep. You could even consider using something like chasteberry to help with progesterone. And you could even, if you may identify as somebody that may have a lot of GI problems or estrogen dominance, you could supplement with something like DIM or use magnesium to help with phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification. And if you did those things, I know this was a couple minutes, Luke, so I apologize. But if you did those few things, chances are you're going to put yourself in a really good position to lose body fat in the future, which should be the goal. And I have to remind a lot of ladies that contact me is not every season is a fat loss season. but that's ultimately what a lot of women want. And so as a coach, and I'm sure Luke will support me on this, is as a coach, we have to be confident enough in our abilities to put our foot down and navigate you, because the reason many women are in the position that they're in now is because they can't navigate themselves.
So true, so true. The power of coaching and having that accountability piece. And I really appreciate you sharing that in detail. And actually, maybe if we could do, I have a couple other questions on specific points in a woman's life, and maybe if we could do the same thing, like kind of your minute or two summary of each of them. So the first one would be, a lot of women we work with, have had children within the last year or two and want to get rid of the baby weight, per se. So how is that approached differently than, someone who hasn't been pregnant or someone who is, beyond that? Like, how do you approach fat loss specifically kind of post-pregnancy?
Yeah, it is 100%. And so I actually just did this morning, I did a 37-minute Instagram live with my wife, who actually works as a birth doula. And we covered all this information on that Instagram live. So if anybody listening to this wants to go check it out, it's on my page at William_Grazione. And it's me and my wife in the video, so you cannot miss it. But it's different. It's different because of the fact that women postpartum are actually in a position where their bodies basically trying to return back to homeostasis. So their hormone levels are basically out of whack. Prolactin, which is prolactation, and that's how they start to produce lactation to feed the baby, that's elevated. And there's a lot of things within their physiology that is essentially not recovered. Okay. So remember what I said earlier about energy availability. In order to recover from anything, don't we need energy? Don't we need rest? Right? Don't we need to take time away from doing stressful things? Absolutely. And so I typically recommend most women to read the book like The First 40 Days. I think that's an exceptional book and teaches a lot about what you should be doing postpartum. But the reason you don't want to rush into fat loss is because prolactin, the hormone that's elevated to produce lactation, is actually fat protective. Okay. So if you're forcing a woman to diet while she's also trying to breastfeed, you could negatively influence her milk supply, which then negatively influences the supply that she's providing to the child, right? And you could obviously imagine the detriment or the depression that would come along with not feeling like you can feed your child, right? That's what the body's designed to do. And so you would be negatively impacting that. My best advice for postpartum moms is to actually spend about 6 months in a what we can call like a thrive phase. Okay. You're eating like 2,000 calories a day. Okay. You're breastfeeding your baby every day. You're resistance training maybe 3 days a week, right? You're staying away from core work until the abdominal wall has completely closed up. And if you just do that, most of the women that I've helped to do this from like, month 3 to 6 to 9 to 12, in many cases, they actually experience significant body recomposition. Okay. Now, for your audience that doesn't understand what that is, it's basically just the net balance of, can I build more muscle and lose body fat, right? Can I actually do them simultaneously? And as long as the net balance is in favor of lean body mass, then that's body recomposition, right? So that's what I would do. I do not recommend anything that you see about postpartum fat loss and challenges after having a baby or anything like that. It does not set the woman up for the long term. Shiny object syndrome, it doesn't help their metabolism, and it will not put them in a position to have a tremendous body composition transformation after that recovery period is over with.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. And again, so many different ways we could go. And now I kind of want to flip the script and now go fast forward. A lot of women also, especially during menopause and post-menopause, really struggle with fat loss as well. What is the best way to approach body recomposition or fat loss during both menopause and post-menopause? If you could sum it up in maybe a couple minutes.
I can. I would say the first thing is don't wait till you're in perimenopause to take action. That's the number one. You got to prepare, right? So the better shape you're in going into perimenopause, the easier it's going to be for you to maintain those habits while you're going through menopause and then you're post-menopausal. The thing we have to understand with menopause in general is that, like I said, the very hormones that make a woman, estrogen and progesterone, and testosterone in small amounts, those hormones are suppressed essentially during menopause, right? Because you lose the ability to procreate. So progesterone will lower, and in many cases, in some instances, estrogen will drop as well. But in most cases, because the progesterone is dropping so much, then they can become estrogen dominant, which does make it hard, right? Low energy, things like that. Now, I'm not going to say that everybody should go out and do this, but something that I have seen that's been helpful is for menopausal and postmenopausal women to actually supplement with something like DHEA or pregnenolone. Okay. I've seen those things help, but nothing's going to help more than you being in a really good position going into perimenopause, making sure that your lifestyle's dialed in, right? Like you're sleeping well, you're exercising, you're moving, you're focusing on calming your system, trying to stay away from alcohol as much as you can, because believe it or not, alcohol is actually metabolized in the liver and so is estrogen, right? So, but when alcohol enters the liver, what essentially happens is that your body shuts down the metabolization of everything else, including estrogen. So therefore, you can actually accumulate estrogen being stored in the liver, which would make you estrogen dominant, which does make it harder to lose body fat.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure a lot of women listening to this right now are getting slightly depressed and like, this is seems all doom and gloom. But no, I appreciate you really sharing in detail all about how the female hormones work and how it does impact body recomposition, both muscle gain and fat loss. Because I think a lot of women have been wondering, we have some women in our program who are always like, well, my husband can, lose weight like this, and then it's so hard for me to lose weight. And as you
Yeah.
mentioned, hormonal imbalances and all, shifts in hormones definitely seem to play a very, very large role. So
Yeah. I would also add this, Luke. As we age, we kind of lose some of our ability to maximally activate muscle protein synthesis. So if you have people that are like 50, 60 years old, those specific people should probably consider eating more high quality protein if they're trying to recomp their body. Because the reality is you can still live a healthy life. Right. You can still feel good. But in most cases, when you get to that point of like feeling like you're like retirement age, like that's normally when you turn to like alcohol and you're going out more and you're not taking as good a care of your health because you want to have fun, that type of thing. And I'm not saying you can never drink, but I think most people would probably benefit from like probably a flush phase or like a detoxification protocol before they get started, especially if they've never done one before in their entire life. So hopefully that helps.
for sure. So I know we're getting, to just a few minutes left here, and I want to make this
Yep.
as actionable as possible for our
Yep.
listeners. And again, you've provided this is amazing information and lots of details. So let's say we get a woman right now who's coming to you, and she just says, maybe you don't even know where she's starting from yet. She just says, "Hey, Will, I want to lose body fat." And let's say it's someone who is premenopausal, maybe in their 30s or 40s,
Yeah.
and has maybe tried a number of diets before, is working out, and wants to, let's say, lose 20 or 30 pounds. So
Yep.
how would you, maybe in a couple of minutes here, kind of explain how you work on that person? You obviously talk about, another thing we could open up a can of worms on is like how long to diet, then take diet breaks, then reverse diet. If you possibly could, in a couple of minutes, explain how you take someone through that process.
Yeah. So as long as they're metabolically healthy, then I'm okay with putting them into a fat loss phase. Okay. But if they're not metabolically healthy, I won't do it because I know better. Right. How would I do that? Essentially, what I would do is I would begin to probably ask them what their calorie intake is currently, and let's just use arbitrary numbers. If they're like, "Hey, William, I've really done my homework. I've followed your information for years. I've been eating 2,000 calories a day for the last 12 months. I work out 4 days a week, and I'm as healthy as an ox." Right? I'm like, "All right, you are a unicorn, right?" Because it rarely happens that way. I would likely begin to start her on lower calories. Typically, probably if she was on 2,000, I might take her low calorie days down to maybe 1,600 or something like that. But probably only diet her maybe 5 or 6 days out of the 7. And then what we basically begin to monitor is because we dropped those 400 calories, is she actually becoming insulin sensitive? Because the reality is a lot of people will take a woman from 2,000 calories, they'll drop them down a couple hundred and they expect them to start losing body fat. but nobody's actually checking their blood glucose levels. Blood glucose levels are a surefire way to decide whether or not somebody's actually in a deficit or not. Because in order for you to be fat oxidative, okay, which means you're a fat loss machine pretty much, your blood glucose levels have to be somewhere between 70 and 90, so somewhere around there. Okay. So if we make this calorie drop, okay, and we start to see her blood sugar go from like 98, 91, 85, 84, and now she's in the 80s, we know it's working, right? But if we do that and the blood glucose doesn't change, right, then we know that, okay, we either have to take more calories away to push her down until basically we get the response that we want, or she's not ready for fat loss yet. Okay. And so then I would begin to diet them down. As long as blood glucose starts to lower, then we should start to see the weight, because in many cases, the weight will follow blood glucose until they get insulin sensitive. And then you can continue to carb cycle them on that amount of calories. The things you'd want to be mindful of is the fact that you can only push a calorie deficit on somebody for so long before they become somewhat adapted, or they develop an urge to binge eat or overeat or something like that. And that's where I believe the diet break concept comes in. It's a proactive tool. I played sports my entire life, and we always had a halftime, right? There was always a halftime. But for some reason in bodybuilding and dieting, nobody believes in halftimes, right? And so when I started to create diet breaks in 2015, I basically said, hey, I played football my whole life. We always had a halftime. You're an awesome athlete. We're going to give you a halftime. And so then basically I started to inject these halftime breaks into my fitness athletes, and they got leaner, felt better, and they showed up better on stage, which ultimately led us to a lot of victories. So I think it's important to have weight loss tools like diet breaks and refeeds and multiple day refeed days for the adherence perspective. Okay. Because if a client can't adhere to your low calorie diet, then guess what? That's not their fault. That's your fault. So you need to be able to develop tools that can help them with adherence. And as they adhere, they can lose more body fat and their metabolism can stay healthier. So if I was taking somebody through a fat loss phase, those are the things that I would recommend. I would also recommend, because it's hard to summarize this in a short period of time, but we have an ebook on our website called The Guide to Dieting Smarter. Luke, if you haven't read it yet, be mindful it's catered to the people that we're talking to, right? So, but if you haven't read it yet, it's a really good resource, and I'd recommend anybody listening to this to go read it, because it's filled with tools. Like, I'm giving you a tool belt, and I'm like, hey, if you got to fix a Phillips head, flathead, bolt, whatever, like, you got the tools for it.
Yeah, for sure. We'll definitely make sure to link that for people as well.
Cool.
Awesome. So yeah, I mean, lots of really valuable information there. And I know we're running up on time here, but if you could leave people with maybe, 30 more seconds of just wisdom to impart, especially when it comes to women, like anything else that you'd say?
Man, I would say set realistic expectations, right? Understand what's realistic, understand pushing too hard is going to have consequences, and understand that eventually you will adapt. And it's very important to be proactive in fat loss so that you don't end up with metabolic adaptation and it's hard for you to lose body fat beyond what you've already done. The other thing is to understand that you should not be dieting like your husband. You should not be on, the same routine as him, because your physiology is different. Another thing is, if you happen to lose your period while you're on a diet, that's a problem. Okay. Your period is your health report card, and you need to pay attention to it. A lot of stuff, but hopefully that helps.
Yeah, for sure. And we'll definitely, like I said, we'll definitely link some of the things that you talked about as well. And yeah, I know we're coming up on time here. I mean, this is just a tremendous amount of information on, why it is harder for women to lose body fat than men, but also some good actionable takeaways for women here as well.
There's one more thing too. I mean, and this is very apparent, but they're just smaller in general, right? They have less lean body mass, right? So just take those as, what they are, as valuable tips. Is, if you have a woman with 100 pounds of lean body mass, that's not much muscle, right? So how much energy is required to move the 100 pounds, right? You take a guy like us and we have 160 pounds of lean body mass. That's 60 more pounds of muscle moving, doing the same thing. You know what I mean? How much more energy can we burn? and then you can take into consideration the hormonal things, but just the fact that women in general are smaller is one of the primary reasons why it's harder for them to lose body fat.
Yeah, very, very true.
Yep.
Muscle mass makes the difference. But
Cool.
yeah, so I know we did it on the last episode as well, but why don't we just leave people with where they can find out more about you?
Yeah, sure. So kind of all over the place, but you can find me at theeducatedDieter.com. I'm on Instagram at William_Grazione. I'm on YouTube, William Grazione. I'm on Facebook, William Grazione. We have our Hey Coach Radio podcast, which has about 100 episodes there. And then you can download 4 or 5 free ebooks on our website. And yeah, that's probably the best ways to get a hold of me.
All right. And as I mentioned, we'll definitely link all those in the show notes as well, so you can go check out more of William's stuff. So William, again, pleasure to have you on again. Thanks for coming back for part 2, and appreciate your time today.
Thank you, brother. I appreciate you as well.